One of my favourite pastimes is to play games with toy soldiers, using rules of my own devising. This video sets out one such set of rules, along with some comments on why they were written that way. My purpose in writing these rules was to create a simple set of rules for pre-gunpowder combat up to about 1200 AD. The original intention was to fight skirmish games, where one figure represents one person. But as the rules developed, I realised that I also wanted to use the same rules to fight larger encounters, where a single figure might represent, say, 30 people. I wanted the rules to produce outcomes that I considered to be realistic, but without trying to reproduce every cut and thrust of combat. I wanted the rules to be streamlined, to keep games moving. Initially, I had another requirement. I wanted the game to use only 6-sided dice, as I find them more aesthetically pleasing. But I realised that to get acceptable outcomes using 6-sided dice required multiple dice rolls for each combat, and this slowed the game down. So the rules are written to use 20-sided dice for all die rolls. I also wanted to minimise housekeeping. I find that having markers all over the table to record the status of figures prevents me from getting imaginatively immersed in a game. Neither do I want to have to keep breaking off from the game to record these things. I want to be playing, not bookkeeping. Finally, I wanted a set of rules that allowed figures flexibility to act either singly or in groups, and allowed groups of figures to be formed and reformed during a game. So, if I have a group of archers, I can send some of them off in one direction and the remainder in another, and if later in the game I want to add some spearmen to one of the resulting groups of archers and move them all together, then I can do so. So, what did I come up with? Let's start with the basics. The first thing you will need is some toy soldiers to play with. These should be based singly. I use 20mm by 20mm bases for figures on foot and 20mm by 40mm bases for mounted figures. But it doesn't really matter. Most of my figures are 1/72nd scale plastic, because that is what I played with back in the last century when I was a child, and because they are really very cheap, which means I can buy lots of them. I use square or rectangular bases because I make my own bases out of cardboard, and it is easier to cut straight lines than curves. Each figure will have its own set of basic statistics, depending on its arms and equipment, and, for fantasy games, its species. In theory, you could field a force of figures, each of which has its own unique statistics. But in practice, I find that very often a force will only contain a small number of different figure types. Although you will need to have a note of the statistics for each figure type, for reference when playing, these can be prepared in advance and the statistics don't change during a game, so no in-game bookkeeping is required. Note that there is no need to group figures into units. Although figures are activated in groups, these groups are not fixed, and all movement and combat takes place at an individual figure level. One figure in each player's force should be nominated as the overall commander of that force. The commander must be nominated at the start of the game and cannot be changed during the game. Measurements in the game are in centimetres because it gives a bit more granularity, allowing games to be played on a smaller table. I typically use a playing area about 3 feet by 4 feet. Movement is measured from centre base to centre base, with the centre of a figure's base being the point where the diagonals of the base intersect. Distances between figures are measured from base edge to base edge. An important concept in the game is contact between figures. Now you could play defining contact between figures as any contact between their bases. However, with the square and rectangular bases I use, I think it looks better if figures in contact are more lined up. So I define contact as being base edge to base edge contact. This means that if two bases are only touching corner to corner or edge to corner, I do not regard them as being in contact. If bases in contact are aligned grid fashion, edge to edge and corner to corner, then I regard them as being in contact. But the contact does not have to be this precise. There just has to be some length of base edge to base edge contact. The concept of a group of figures is also important. Figures are activated in groups. A group of figures consists of any number of friendly figures such that each figure is in contact with another figure in the group, and any two figures in the group are connected by a chain of figures in such contact, all figures in that chain being in the group. The last point is relevant because a player does not have to include a figure in a group just because it meets the requirements to be included. Enough of these technicalities. How do you actually play the game? Well, the game is played in turns, with these turns alternating between players. Each turn consists of 3 phases: the movement phase, the missile phase, and the melee phase. In the movement phase, the player whose turn it is successively attempts to activate groups of figures. If a group of figures is successfully activated, then the figures in that group can move, and the other player may then be able to react to that movement. If activation is unsuccessful, or the player whose turn it is decides not to try and activate any more figures, then that ends the movement phase. To activate a group of figures, a player must first specify the figures constituting that group. This can be any group of one or more figures meeting the criteria for a group as previously described. The group does not have to correspond wholly or partially to any group of figures previously activated. There is no limit to the number of times a figure or group of figures can be activated in the same turn. To activate a group of figures, roll a d20. The activation is successful if the number rolled is greater than the number of figures in the group to be activated, plus 1 if at least one figure in the group is within 15 centimetres of the commander, or plus 2 otherwise. So, to activate a group of 4 figures, all of which are more than 15 centimetres from the commander, requires a roll of 7 or more. So you've got 4 figures in the group, there's no commander involved, so it's plus 2, which gives you 6, and you need to roll more than that, so you need to roll 7. To activate a group of 6 figures, one of which is within 15 centimetres of the commander, requires a roll of 8 or more. You've got 6 figures, they're within 15 centimetres of the commander, so you add 1, that gives you 7. You need to roll more than 7, you need to roll an 8. The commander can be activated like any other figure and is considered to be within 15 centimetres of itself. Assuming the activation is successful, then each activated figure can, but does not have to, move. Activated figures are moved sequentially, in any order selected by the controlling player. The rules on movement are simple. Each figure can move up to its full movement allowance, modified for terrain as appropriate. Movement does not have to be in a straight line, can be in any direction, and a figure can rotate on the centre of its base while moving. A figure cannot move so that any part of its base overlaps impassable terrain or the base of another figure, whether friend or foe, at any point as the figure moves. However, A figure can slide past any other figures which it may be in base-to-base contact with at any point during its move, as long as the bases do not overlap at any point. There is one circumstance where bases may overlap as a figure moves, in that a figure can move so that for a time its base overlaps or passes through the base of a friendly figure that was activated simultaneously with it, so that was in the same group that was activated. A figure can never end its move with its base overlapping the base of any other figure. There is one further restriction on moving. A figure that starts its move in contact with an enemy figure cannot move at all unless it moves into a position where, if the figure it was in contact with was immediately activated, it would not be able to move back into contact with the figure that's moved away. This requires figures breaking away from combat to put some distance or obstacle between them and their opponents, and reflects the difficulty in breaking off combat with someone unless you can outpace them or go somewhere that they cannot follow. Any figure moving off the table for any reason is removed from the game. Once the player whose turn it is has activated a group of figures and finished moving them about, the other player has the opportunity to reactively activate some figures. The reason that the rules allow for reactive activations is so that figures have an opportunity to range attack figures that are charging into them or moving past them, and can also try to evade figures that charge into them. There are two ways figures can be reactively activated. Firstly, if an enemy figure moves into contact with one of your figures, then that figure automatically reactively activates. Secondly, the reacting player can also try to activate a single group of figures in the usual manner. Now, that group can include figures that have automatically reactively activated, but if it does, those figures only get one reactive action, they don't get two, although in theory they might have been reactively activated twice. Any such group that you're nominating and then dicing for in the normal way must be activated before you do anything with your automatically reactively activated figures. Note that if a player tries to reactively activate a group of figures and fails, that does not end the movement phase, in the same way as it would if the player whose turn it was tried to activate a group of figures and failed. Each reactively activated figure must either immediately make a range attack on a figure that has just moved, move away from contact with an enemy figure that has just moved into contact with it, or do nothing. Once the reactive actions have been completed, play passes back to the player whose turn it is, who can seek to activate a group of figures in the normal way. It is not possible to reactively activate figures in response to an action by a reactively activated figure. The usual rules for movement, including those about moving away from contact with an enemy figure, apply to reactively activated figures. In addition, a reactively activated figure that moves cannot end that move in contact with an enemy figure. So reactive activation is about evading. You can't reactively activate and then charge into somebody. The usual rules for resolving missile attacks apply to reactively activated figures, except that a reactively activated figure can always make a range attack on a figure that has just moved into contact with it. So if you're reacting to a figure moving into contact with you, you can always shoot them as they come in, effectively. Once the movement phase is complete, which will be either when the player's turn it is tries and fails to activate a group of figures, or when that player decides he doesn't want or she doesn't want to activate any more figures, then play moves on to the missile phase. In this phase, every figure on both sides that is equipped with a range weapon may make a range attack. All of these range attacks are considered to be simultaneous. Both players must declare all such range attacks before any of them are resolved. Declaring a range attack includes specifying the target figure and any speed adjustment to be applied. So in order to make a range attack, the range attacking figure must have a clear line of sight to the target figure, and the target figure has to be within range. The range attack can be made in any direction. Facing of the figure doesn't matter. In fact, generally in these rules, the facing of figures doesn't matter. There are some restrictions on making range attacks. So normally you can't make a range attack if you're in contact with an enemy figure, and neither can you make a range attack if your target is in contact with a figure that's friendly to you. The exceptions to those rules are, firstly, if you are a figure that's been reactively activated and you're making a range attack as part of that reactive activation against a figure that has just moved into contact with you, you can always range attack that particular figure. And the second thing is, if you're armed with javelins, you can make a range attack if you are in contact with an enemy figure. And that would be the case even if the enemy figure that you're range attacking is itself in contact with another figure that is friendly to you. Basically, if you're in a melee, you can throw a javelin, but you can't start drawing a bow or loading a crossbow or whatever. Now, I mentioned line of sight and speed adjustment, so I'd better define them. Line of sight is the straight line running centre base to centre base, and it's blocked by the base of any figure, friendly or enemy, other than the range attacking figure and the target figure. It's also blocked by ground that is higher than both the range attacking figure and the target figure. And other terrain may also block line of sight, and I'll talk about that in more detail when I talk about terrain. Now, the speed adjustment. This reflects a situation where, for example, an archer quickly looses 2 or 3 arrows rather than a single well-aimed one. A player may choose to apply a speed adjustment of up to the speed of the relevant range weapon. So, for example, an archer using a bow with a speed of 2 might apply a speed adjustment of 0, 1 or 2. Okay, so that's all you need to know about range attacks really, other than how to resolve them, and that is very straightforward. To resolve a range attack, you calculate the relevant to hit value, and this is the target figure's defense value, plus 2 if that target figure is in cover, less the range attacking figure's range attack value, less any speed adjustment. Having calculated that to hit number, you roll 2d20 and you need to score greater than or equal to the to hit number on both of those dice. If you do that, the figure's killed and you remove it from play. If you don't do that, there's no effect. Note that the speed adjustment is incorporated into the to hit number rather than by rolling to hit multiple times. And the reason it's done that way is, firstly, it keeps the game moving, and secondly, it reflects the fact that speedily loosing missiles in quick succession is likely to reduce accuracy. The other thing you'll notice about missile attacks, range attacks, is there is no adjustment for range. If you're within range, you can attack, and it doesn't matter how far away your target is. And that's simply for simplicity and speed of play. It involves having to faff around calculating ranges and additional adjustments. The final point about range attacks is ammunition. Now, ammunition, to my mind, is quite important. Archers can run out of arrows. If I'm running about with javelins, there's a limit to the number of javelins I can carry. I can't just keep throwing javelins forever. The problem with ammunition is that keeping track of ammunition can be a really tedious piece of bookkeeping that distracts from play, and you'd rather not do it. So I've reached a compromise here, and that is to keep track of ammunition at the level of each side. So each side will have a total amount of ammunition for each type of ranged weapon that figures in that side may be armed with. And every time a figure on that side makes a range attack with a ranged weapon of that type, that stock of ammunition is reduced by 1, plus the amount of any speed adjustment. So, if the speed adjustment represents the fact you're firing off 2 arrows, then clearly the stock of ammunition would be reduced by 2. When the stock of ammunition for a particular type of ranged weapon is exhausted, no figures on that side can make range attacks with that type of ranged weapon. Now, it may be that you think that this is an oversimplification. After all, it does mean that ammunition is being pooled between different figures that may be widely distant from each other, and I admit that's not realistic. If you want, you can keep track of ammunition on a more granular basis, although I'm not convinced that the added realism justifies the extra record keeping. But I do think that doing it on a more granular basis is better than just allowing everyone unlimited ammunition. That approach is simple, but in my experience it leads to behaviours and outcomes in the game which strike me as unacceptably unrealistic. Anyway, after the missile phase, everyone's had a shot who's eligible to do so, we move on to the melee phase. This consists of up to 5 combat rounds and a single pursuit round. The first combat round is for figures with an initiative of 5, the next for those with an initiative of 4, down to the final combat round, which is for figures with an initiative of 1. In each round, firstly identify all the figures on both sides with a relevant initiative that are in contact with an enemy figure, and those figures are the figures that will participate in that round, the figures with that initiative. Note that contact is based on the position of figures at the start of each combat round, not at the beginning of the melee phase. Each participating figure will attack one enemy figure that it is in contact with, and you can choose which one. Attacks can be made in any direction, so the facing of figures, again, is not relevant. The figures to be attacked by each participating figure must all be specified before any attacks are resolved. All attacks within a single combat round are assumed to be simultaneous. So if you've got 2 figures with the same initiative and they're fighting each other, they're in contact, they can both kill each other. For each participating figure, you calculate the 2 hit number for its attack. And this is calculated very simply. You take the defending figure's defense value and you reduce it by the attacking figure's attack value. And then you roll 2 20-sided dice. Now, as for missile attacks, if both of those dice roll a number that is equal to or greater than the 2 hit number, then the defending figure is killed outright and you just remove it from the game. If one of the dice rolls a number which is greater than or equal to the 2 hit number, and the other die rolls a 1, a 2 or a 3, then the defending figure is pushed back. And if it cannot be pushed back, it's killed. If one of the dice rolls a number that is equal to or higher than the 2 hit number, and the other die rolls a number which is less than the 2 hit number but greater than 3, then the defending figure is pushed back. And if it can't be pushed back, there is no effect. And finally, if both dice roll numbers which are less than the 2 hit number, there's no effect. Talked about figures being pushed back. A pushed back figure is moved directly away from the figure that pushed it back in a straight line in a direction perpendicular to the line of contact between the 2 figures' base edges. Subject to the usual movement rules, the pushed back figure can rotate about its centre base as it moves, as decided by the controlling player. A pushed back figure must move back until it encounters a friendly figure, approaches an enemy figure, arrives at impassable terrain, or until it has used its entire movement allowance, adjusted for terrain if appropriate. The usual movement rules apply, except that the restrictions on moving away from contact with enemy figures do not apply to figures that are being pushed back. So a pushback figure doesn't have to move into a position where the figure it's moving away from couldn't move immediately back into contact if it was then activated. A pushed back figure cannot move into contact with an enemy figure, and a pushback move is required to end at any point where continuing to move in the required direction would reduce the distance between the pushed back figure and the then nearest enemy figure. If it is not possible for a pushed back figure to move at least 2 centimetres in the required direction, then the figure cannot be pushed back and it does not move. And in those circumstances, the figure that would have been pushed back is either killed or suffers no effect, depending on whether or not either die has rolled a 3 or less. If it is possible to move back at least 2 centimetres, then the pushed back figure must do so. So it might be that, sometimes you can only move back 2 centimetres if you rotate your base in a particular way as you're moving. If you can do it, you have to do it. If a figure is subject to multiple attacks in the same round, then if any of these attacks results in a kill, the figure is killed. If a figure is pushed back multiple times in the same combat round, then only one pushback movement is put into effect, and the attacking player gets to decide which. So the player whose attack caused the pushbacks gets to decide which pushback gets put into effect. In each combat round, the player with the initiative moves all his pushback figures in the order of his choice before the other player does the same. After all the combat rounds have been resolved, move on to the pursuit round. In this round, any figure that was in contact with an enemy figure at the start of this melee phase has not itself been pushed back in this melee phase and is no longer in contact with any enemy figure, can be activated at the discretion of its controlling player, and that activation is automatic, you don't have to roll for it. The only thing such a figure can do is pursue an enemy, and that involves the figure moving in any way it pleases, with the condition that its move must end with the figure in contact with an enemy figure that has been pushed back in this melee phase. The normal movement rules for activated figures apply, and all the figures on a given side that are eligible to move in the pursuit round are considered to be simultaneously activated, so they can move through each other, but not through other figures. The player whose turn it is gets to move all their pursuing figures in any order they choose first, and then the other player, they get to move their pursuing figures. And for the avoidance of doubt, you can't reactively activate figures in response to figures that are moved because they've been pushed back in combat or because they are pursuing. You can only reactively activate in the movement phase. At this point, I have covered all the core rules, all the core mechanics of the game. I'll go on to talk about terrain and how you calculate statistics for the figures in the game shortly. But before I do so, I just want to address something. You may think that I've missed something out. In particular, shouldn't I have a fourth phase in each turn, which deals with morale? Well, I don't think I should. And the reason for that is because I believe that morale should be scenario-based or incorporated in victory conditions, or both. Sometimes, the situation you're gaming will be such that you would expect a force to fight to the last man and the last arrow. Sometimes it'll be such that a force might break and run if its commander is killed, or if it has suffered a certain level of casualties. If you're playing a game as part of a campaign, and I usually am, then there is often a natural point in the game where one side or the other thinks better to get out of here and save my men, save my forces to fight another day. So all of these things, I think the players should decide depending on the particular game they're playing, rather than being written inflexibly into a set of rules. Anyway, so much for morale. Let's talk about terrain. One key aspect of this is how terrain affects movement, and I wanted this to be simple. So I didn't want to have to start doing lots of sums, reducing movement distances by a certain amount every time someone crosses a hedge, and then by a different amount if they cross a stream, or then start saying, well, they're moving through a forest, so all their moves count double distance or something. It just gets very complicated. So I've adopted a very simple system where each figure has a standard movement distance and a terrain movement distance. If they do not encounter terrain in their move, they can move their standard distance. If they do move through terrain, no matter what sort of terrain it is, or how many different types of it they get entangled with as they're moving, they're restricted to their terrain movement distance. And a figure is considered to have moved into, over, or through terrain if any part of its base has overlapped that terrain at any stage in the figure's move. I'll now talk about terrain in a bit more detail under 3 headings: hills, trees, and other. And I'm going to cover them in reverse order. So on screen you can see a table that shows some different types of terrain and the properties of each. The first column indicates whether the terrain is impassable. No figure can move so that any part of its base overlaps or moves through impassable terrain at any time. Buildings, high walls and rivers fall into the category of impassable terrain. Now, you may observe that, of course, buildings do have doors, and if you want to play a particular scenario where figures can move into buildings, you can do so. But my default rules assume that, finding themselves in the middle of a battle, the householders will have locked their doors and shuttered all their windows. And you may also observe that rivers can be crossed. And yes, you can. Under these rules, you can cross a river at a bridge, which just counts as normal ground, or by way of a ford. And a ford counts as terrain, so if you move into, through or over a ford, you're restricted to your terrain movement distance. The next column on the table looks at linear obstacles, and these include streams, hedges and low walls. Now, if a figure's base overlaps or crosses a linear obstacle at any point while moving, that figure is restricted to its terrain movement distance. Further, a figure cannot finish a move in a position where its base straddles a linear obstacle, unless it's doing that in order to move into contact with an enemy figure. Finally, linear obstacles do not prevent contact between figures. Linear obstacles are assumed to have no width when determining whether figures are in contact. So if you've got 2 figures on opposite sides of a low wall, you just assume that wall is not there when determining whether or not those figures are in contact. The next column indicates whether the terrain provides cover. If the line of sight from a range attacking figure to a target figure crosses a low hedge or a low wall, and the range attacking figure is not in contact with that hedge or wall, then the target figure is in cover. Finally, the final column shows which terrain types block line of sight. It's self-explanatory. The next thing to consider is trees. Now there's 2 ways you can represent trees on the tabletop in this game. The first approach, which you would probably use for skirmish games, is to represent individual trees. And in that case, the base of each tree is considered to be impassable and to block line of sight. The second approach is to say that there are certain areas of the tabletop which are woodland. So the first point to note is woodland is impassable to horse-mounted cavalry, but not to wolf riders. And any other figures are restricted to their terrain movement distance if any portion of their move is through woodland. If the centre of a target figure's base is in an area of woodland, then that figure is assumed to be in cover. And line of sight is blocked by more than 1 centimetre of woodland that is not covered by the base of either the target or the range attacking figure. Finally, on terrain, let's talk about hills. If a hill is between 2 figures, it blocks line of sight between them. A figure that is not on a hill does not block line of sight between 2 other figures if either of those figures is on a hill. And a hedge or low wall that is not on a hill does not provide cover if the range attacking and or the target figure is on a hill, unless the target figure is adjacent to and at the same level as the hedge or the wall. So if you're standing right behind the hedge, it still provides cover. If you're standing some distance back, the person on the hill can see over the hedge and shoot you. If a figure's base crosses or overlaps a contour line at any point when moving, and I'm assuming here that you're representing hills by way of contours, then movement is restricted to the terrain movement distance, and that's whether you're going up or down the hill. So, all you now need to start playing are the key statistics for each of your figures. And I've got a picture on screen which shows how you might record these key statistics for two example figures. And for our examples, we're going to use a Roman legionary and an unarmoured horse archer. So, how do you calculate these numbers? The first thing to do is to decide on the species of each of your figures. Now, for historical games, figures will be human. But in fantasy games, you might want to use dwarves, elves, halflings, goblins, or orcs. Figures can be on foot or mounted. Humans and elves can be mounted on horses. Goblins or orcs can be mounted on wolves. Now, both our example figures are human. The Roman legionary is on foot, while the horse archer is, unsurprisingly, mounted on a horse. Next thing to think about is armour. Figures can be unarmoured, lightly armoured, which might be a figure wearing a gambeson or padded armour, or a figure that's partially armoured, some fantasy figure that's got a chainmail bikini on or something. Or fully armoured. And fully armoured basically means chainmail or lorica segmentata or something like that. These rules were really designed for periods predating the introduction of full plate armour. If you want to design your own statistics for plate armour, off you go, knock yourself out. A figure can also use a shield, unless it's equipped with a bow or a crossbow or a two-handed weapon. If you want to use a figure that's waving a Dane axe with a shield on its back, you can, but the figure gets no benefit from the shield. So, if we look at our Roman legionary, he will be fully armoured, he will be carrying a shield, and the horse archer is unarmoured, so no armour and no shield. Now, the next step is weapons. So each figure must either carry one melee weapon and no range weapon, or they can carry one range weapon and then a dagger or a one-handed sword. And for this purpose, a one-handed sword would include something like an axe or a mace or another comparable one-handed weapon. Mounted figures cannot use two-handed melee weapons. They cannot use heavy javelins, and they cannot use warbows. And warbows cannot be used by halflings because they're too weak to draw them. Now, our Roman legionary will be carrying a pilum, which will count as a heavy javelin, and a sword. And we'll assume that our horse archer has a hunting bow and again a sword. So once you've decided upon what your figure represents and what equipment it's got, what weapons it's got, you can calculate the relevant statistics. So the first thing to calculate is the movement distance in centimetres, and I've set out on screen how you calculate that. So for our Roman legionary, his movement distance will be 16 centimetres, less 4 centimetres because he's fully armoured, less another centimetre because he's carrying a shield. And that gives you a movement distance of 11 centimetres. On the other hand, our unarmoured horse archer will have a movement distance of 16 centimetres. There aren't any penalties for armour or equipment, but because she's riding a horse, she gets a bonus of 12 centimetres, so her total movement distance is 28 centimetres. So that's the standard movement distance. We now need to work out the terrain movement distance. And to work that out, we first calculate a terrain penalty. and we then subtract that from the movement distance. And once we've subtracted that, if that comes up with a terrain movement distance that's less than 5 centimetres, we increase it back up to 5 centimetres. 5 centimetres is the minimum terrain movement distance. So for our Roman, the terrain movement penalty will be 3 centimetres, plus a centimetre for his shield, plus 2 centimetres for his heavy javelin. That gives you a total of 6 centimetres penalty. Subtracting that from his movement distance of 11 centimetres gives a terrain movement distance of 5 centimetres. For the horse archer, she will have a terrain movement penalty of 4. So her terrain movement distance is going to be 28 minus 4, 24 centimetres. The next thing to work out is the defence value, and that's taken from the table on screen. You can see that your defence value depends on what armour you're wearing, whether you've got a shield and whether or not you're mounted. The Roman legionary is fully armoured, on foot with a shield. Their defence value is therefore 15, which is the highest you can get. And the horse archer has no armour, no shield, and is sitting on a horse making a nice big target, and their defence value is therefore 10, which is the lowest defence value you can have. The next thing to consider are the statistics for range attacks, and these depend on the range weapon carried, and they are as shown on screen. If no range weapon is carried, clearly you won't need these statistics, but both our example figures carry range weapons, so we do need to calculate them. Let's start with the horse archer. So she has a hunting bow, that's got ammunition of 12, a speed of 2, a range attack value of 0, and a range of 36 centimetres in a game where one figure represents one person, refer to that as a skirmish game, or 20 centimetres in a game where one figure represents, say, 25 or 30 people, so a more of a battle type game. And let's assume we're playing a battle game, so our one figure here is representing, say, 30 horse archers. So what do we write on her stat sheet? Well, we will record her range as 20 centimetres and her range attack as being between 0 and 2. And that's been calculated basically starting from her base attack value of 0 and saying that we can add a speed adjustment of 0, 1 or 2 to it. So the possible range of attack values is 0 to 2. If we now turn to our Roman, he's got a heavy javelin. We see this has ammunition of 1, a speed of 0, attack value of 1, and a range of 3 centimetres in a game where one figure represents 25 or 30 figures, so a battle game, which is what we're assuming we're playing. We therefore record the range as 3 centimetres, and the range attack value is just 1. There is no option to vary that using a speed adjustment. The ammunition number is not recorded on the individual figure statistics because we record that at the level of the side. So we total up the number of figures on each side that are armed with a particular range weapon. We multiply that by the ammunition value for that range weapon. That gives us a total ammunition value for that side. And every time figures shoot that sort of ammunition, we reduce that total ammunition value. Looking at the statistics on the screen, there are some observations that you might make. Firstly, note that crossbows are meant to be early medieval crossbows. They're not these very heavy crossbows used later in the medieval period that needed a windlass to load them, and the statistics reflect that. Also, although warbows outrange crossbows on the battlefield, you'll note that this is not so in a skirmish game. That's not a mistake, it's intentional. At a range above about 100 yards, to put an arrow into a single person who can see it coming and get out of the way is difficult, no matter how far your bow can in theory shoot. This does not apply so much on a battlefield when you'd be shooting into a crowd of people who'd find it harder to get out of the way rather than at an individual. Now, I've given slings a pretty long range, and I believe this is consistent with historical accounts and modern day experience. And you will also note that there are 2 lines of statistics for a sling, depending on whether or not a shield is carried. This is because I think carrying a shield would make it harder and therefore more time consuming to load a sling. so the speed adjustment is reduced for a sling carried with a shield. The only other point on missile weapons is that if halflings are using javelins, then you reduce the range attack value of the javelin by 1. So the range attack value for a halfling with a heavy javelin will be 0. A halfling's heavy javelin is anyone else's light javelin, and a halfling using a light javelin would have a range attack value of -1. Halflings are pathetic. That only leaves the figures for melee attacks. Again, these depend on the weapon carried and are shown on screen at the moment. Initiative basically represents the reach of a weapon, and so it determines who gets first chance to hit. Attack value represents both how easy it is to land a meaningful hit with the weapon, and also the damage that weapon can do if you're successful in getting that hit on target. Now our Roman legionary is armed with a sword and he's on foot, so he has an initiative of 2 and an attack value of 2. Our horse archer is also armed with a sword, but she is mounted, so she has an initiative of 3 but an attack value of only 1. And the reason that attack value is a bit lower is that it's harder to hit someone with a sword if you're balanced on top of a horse. You aren't going to be doing such intricate fencing moves. Finally, there are some modifications to the base numbers for fantasy games. In particular, because halflings have short little arms, their initiative score is reduced by 1, with a minimum of 1. And because they're so feeble and useless, their melee attack score, whatever weapon they're using, is also reduced by 1. On the other hand, the melee attack score for goblins or orcs riding wolves is increased by 1, as the wolf can get stuck in as well as the rider. Wolf riders are scary. They are fast, they could ride into forests so there's no place to hide, and when they catch you, they will rip you to pieces. Better carry a spear and hope you can push them back before they get close enough to attack you. Or just shoot them. Anyway, that's enough for now. There's enough information here to play the game, so do give it a go, and in any case, I hope you have found this video interesting. Goodbye, until next time.